So next up we have John Paul Ashenfelter. He is a longtime Rails developer who saw the birth of the web browser at NCSA in the mid-1990s and never looked back. He has built dozens of Rails applications over the years, started companies, joined startups, managed the API team that builds the open source Rails application that runs va.org, and worked with more tech education and boot camps than he can count. He's taken time to do a retreat at the Recurse Center, written a few books long time ago, and worked with many outstanding developers over the years. He has founded a food co-op, which has nothing to do with Rails development, but is still a pretty cool fact. He's an avid hiker and traveler of the Blue Ridge and beyond with a strong affinity for New Orleans. He loves music of all kinds and enjoys reading sci-fi. He's failed to earn a PhD 3 times across 2 disciplines, but has never second-guessed the now smooth and sensible-looking path that took him from Visual Basic and an academic career through the startup world to here. And today, he's going to talk to us about his Rails app being old enough to drink. John Paul.
Hey, folks, I'm excited to be here. I want to take you back to the year 2000. We all survived the Y2K apocalypse. We had the first big internet bubble in full swing. Some of you may not have even been born yet in 2000 or close to it. But empowered by my extensive experience as a founding CTO for a science education startup, and then as a lead engineer for a web-based game company, I took my full 9 months of startup experience and through ludicrous coincidences raised money to start a startup. Welcome to Transition Point. I built an equity partner consulting company. We call that a venture studio today. And we started surfing that first wave of internet excitement. At Transition Point, we did all the things you'd expect in the 2000s. We built a leisure travel company. We supported another game studio. We built a warehouse logistics company. We hosted a project that ran during a Super Bowl ad. That was exciting. And somehow we ended up hosting the re-election site for the incumbent president of Nigeria at one point, on purpose. And we filled in the gaps with normal consulting. A couple months into this journey, Kai walks into my office. He owns and runs a second-generation family business. This business works with this other kind of business called newspapers. Hundreds of them around the country. And what they do is every week, more or less, they send out a religion feature on the religion page of that. This was from Mother's Day this year. App still runs Mother's Day this year from the app. But when they send it out, remember, this is 2000. We're just through the Y2K apocalypse. They send it out on CD-ROMs. They're EPS and TIFF files. We hadn't even gotten to PDF yet. They put it in an envelope and put it in the mail. And they have a calendar that looks something like this because every one of the 460-some newspapers has a different publication schedule and a different number of days they want to get it in advance of. So Kai comes in with this problem. We decide that we could do a better job of delivering this feature. So we signed a contract, we built a proof of concept, and we pulled out our handy tools of choice for web development. All-air cold fusion, and an open source convention over configuration framework called Fusebox. Rails wasn't the first one, people. A few weeks later, we launched the production application. We started distributing that TIFF file, those EPS images, through email and launched a client download site along with an admin application. And then we integrated it with his bespoke billing system, which was written in Microsoft Access. We really had succeeded. It looked like this. So why am I telling you this? We're at a Ruby conference, right? So I'm talking about cold fusion at a Ruby conference. Well, I've done the opposite too, so it balances out. I talked about Ruby a lot at cold fusion conferences, but I'm gonna fast forward to the year 2005, 5 years forward. I am in Portland at this conference, the O'Reilly Open Source Convention. I had just finished doing something that was yet another one of my careers. I was teaching a class on data warehousing with MySQL. I see my friend Eric, who's a prolific open source contributor to Java, which is what you contributed to in 2005. We are waiting in line at this trendy restaurant up in the Pearl in Portland, and someone notices Eric and say, "Hey, Eric, come join us." And then the magic words, "We're billing dinner to the client." Who's at dinner? Well, the guy who invited us over was James Duncan Davidson. Does that name mean anything to anybody here? Okay, yeah, enough people. He wrote little things like Tomcat, which was the server you used when you were deploying Java applications back in the day. Again, we're in 2005. He wrote Ant, which was the original automation software. Now he is Toby's advisor at Shopify and a photographer, so he's kind of gone full scope here. But also at this table, a guy named Glenn Vanderberg, who was just like this titan of the free and open source JavaScript, or sorry, God forbid, JavaScript, Java world. So Glenn Vanderberg was there. Rich Kilmer was there. Rich Kilmer was one of the first people in this entire country to really do anything with Ruby, and he did it of all places at DARPA for the federal government. There's fascinating stories in there, but he's sitting there. This guy's sitting there, who some of you may have heard of, Dave Thomas. He founded this company called The Pragmatic Programmer. Maybe you've seen them. And then there's this other guy at the table, this guy. So what are they celebrating and billing the client for? Well, they are having a few drinks, and they're very excited because the two Davids had just gotten the first proofs of a book. This book. It had literally been delivered straight to OSCON, so they had it to sell. Again, we're in 2005. So they had a copy of this book. What's Rails? I ask. What is Rails? 2005. Let's go back to what the Rails world looked like in 2005. You had a few broad choices for building web apps. You could use PHP, Perl, maybe a shell script through CGI. This was like complete and utter spaghetti because you had a language, not a framework. Every team had to figure out everything from scratch. You had to figure out your routing conventions, how you're going to access data. Forget about having any good deployment tooling or secret management. Heck, even naming conventions were something you had arguments about. Batteries were not included with anything. You always did it from scratch. This was really hard. And even once you figured it out, you had to keep enforcing it across all of these developers as you scaled, have them all keep agreeing, not just in principle, but in fact. And then, you were done. You had your version of spaghetti that would somehow work for building web applications. You had one other option. You could, at least one other option. You could let the collective assimilate you. So web objects from Apple was an option like one person chose apparently at some time. Web objects was $50,000 back in this day. I kid you not, $50,000 for web objects. You could get Microsoft ASP for free with IIS, which meant you're running Windows servers. Netscape had, wait for it people, server-side JavaScript. Back in those days with Livewire, it's not a new thing. Server-side JavaScript is an old thing. You could actually do JScript and ASP in 2000 if you were a person that did that. So server-side JavaScript's not new. Macromedia had this thing called Spectra. Tango, anybody use Tango? Lasso with FileMaker Pro, so many options. There's one other thought. You could do open source Java. This was a world many of us lived in. It was a world of pain and suffering. You open the box, and this is where you ended up and who was looking at you. You had XML, you had object hierarchies, you had J2EE, you had server beans, you had jar files and war files. This was not a world many of us wanted to live in. All of a sudden, there's one other person you can choose, this guy, because of this announcement. I'll let you spend a second reading it. This was the very first announcement publicly of Rails. What did Rails look like? This was in July the 25th. 25th is a great numerical number in Ruby on Rails world. This was about a year before that dinner. Rails was this. It was a gem called Rails, a gem called Action Pack for doing request and response, a gem called Active Record. None of them, by the way, had the same version number. They were just like random libraries that worked together. Well, they weren't random, but they worked together. So this is what we had. Now I knew what Rails was. What can I do with Rails? My entire software development career at this point had been focused on getting databases onto the web as fast as possible. Cold Fusion had been the best way to do that, no joke. But Rails changed the game. I was already using a convention over configuration framework, so I was pretty comfortable with the idea of Rails. But here's some of the things that were different. Rails, among many other things, was free as in beer. Cold Fusion license was $1,000, $5,000 for Cold Fusion Enterprise. IIS had its own costs. You want to run J2EE servers, you're likely buying WebSphere from IBM. This was not a world a lot of people in this room probably remember how it was. But it was a big deal. I was saving $1,000 to $5,000 per server per project by moving over to Rails. Numbers made sense. It was object-oriented instead of the spaghetti we were looking at a minute ago. It treated testing as a fundamental idea that was important. And it included active record, which solved the problem of mapping database records onto objects. And you think that's not so big a deal, and you think, oh, active record's not the best pattern. I vividly remember one company we paid for Top Hat, ORM for Java. We paid a $50,000 a year license. Again, a number that keeps popping up in this world. $50,000 a year for basically active record, except in Java with J2EE and all that enterprise stuff. So things were really changing in this world. Came back from OSCON. I experimented with Rails. I got better at testing. I learned Selenium. I just jumped straight in with this, did a few toy applications, and then I was like, Kai's application is only a few thousand lines of code. This is a big rewrite that could work. A few thousand lines was no big deal. So I had Selenium tests, so I could A/B the web side of both of them, Rails and not Rails. And by the fall of 2005, I had decided, this was something I could do. I shipped one of the apps, then I shipped 2 more of his apps because he had a couple of little side apps that we had built. And by the end of 2005, the reverse of this, I was teaching Ruby on Rails at Cold Fusion conferences. I didn't get everything right because I was also teaching classes on XML and XSLT and XDoclet and stuff, which are technologies, if you've never heard of, it's just as well. They died the death they should have. And by 2006, I was leading workshops and giving conference presentations on testing tools and frameworks for web development. I had completely converted. This is what we started with when we were building the app. This is a Dell Latitude D600 that I pulled off of CNET's review from ancient times. This was the world we lived in. You looked around a room like this at a conference. They were all Dells, HPs, a couple of folks had Gateways, and the corporate types had IBMs. You were running Windows, full stop. That is what the development world looked like. Also, we had heavy laptops that the amount of time, the hours and the weight were pretty much equivalent. 5-hour battery, 5 pounds of weight, 6-hour battery, 6 pounds of weight, 2 batteries, 10 pounds. I had an 11-pound laptop at one point, I kid you not. But also batteries could burst into flames. So it was a different world. In those days, you bought your editor. One way or another, you bought it. You subscribed to an ecosystem like Microsoft Developer Network or Sun Java Developer Network or Cold Fusion Partner Developer Network or Red Hat or whatever. You paid for your tools. I mean, what a world this was. Fancy people bought Dreamweaver or WebSphere Application Developer. People who loved tables bought NetObjects Fusion. Some of us used HomeSite, which was a beautiful tool that later Macromedia bought and turned into Cold Fusion Studio because it was a great tool. Early Mac users used BBEdit. 1992, people, BBEdit, 1992. So it is probably older than some of you all. And if you wanted a free editor, or you were in Java, which probably meant both things, you used Eclipse. We use Subversion for version tracking. Swear to whoever you want to swear to. People would argue whether you needed version control, even in 2005. I kid you not, for the web. We would have discussions about if you needed it. The difference between then and now is we could say, and which tool do you choose? How many people have ever used something other than Git? Sorry, I should have said for version control, right? Of course, right? Yeah, right. There were a lot of choices back in those days, but Subversion was the one most people were moving towards. Subversion 1.2, which was the big release, came out in 2005, again, a magical year. 2005, Git comes out, the first release, magical year. You shipped on MySQL, full stop. Postgres was hard to use. It didn't run on Windows. Remember, we're in a Windows world. Running Postgres 8 under Wine was not something you could do for web development, let alone for shipping. Okay, a lot of people use SQL Server too. Entirely different discussion. MySQL, though, was what most people used, especially people who were building web applications. Can you name the other database that was used a lot during the early 2000s? Okay, those are all nice answers. This database was used everywhere. I kind of gave you the idea earlier. Those are correct answers too. Oracle, DB2, Informix, all those other ones. And then when you wanted to deploy your app, You had to buy stuff to deploy it on, physical hardware. We had an office with a Windows NT server and a T1 line, and then we moved the same box, like put it on a shelf in a colo. And then later on, we got this sexy little Cobalt box, which was sort of like a Plesk, a whole Plesk device all put together with everything just working. They were beautiful. They were half size, so you could put them front and back in a rack. A rack has 42 slots, so you could put 84 of these in and run the cables down the middle. I didn't have 84 of them, I had 2. But it was really fun to be able to work with those. But that's what web looked like. We used that, all of that technology that was coming to build the new Rails-based website. It looked like this. That's exactly the same as it was before, because everything that changed was on the inside. We shipped it on Rails 0.14, which was really a 1.0 release candidate. The way we deployed it usually was we checked it out from Subversion on the server. Any of you have used Capistrano? Capistrano was kind of just doing what stuff happened, how development happened in those days. Anyhow, so how did things change really for me over those 5 years where I changed from Cold Fusion to Rails, and between then and now? It's been a lot of years. This Rails app is 24 years old. So the changes in the app are exactly the same changes you saw in the Ruby ecosystem. One of the biggest changes of all was developer experience. That was the single best thing about Rails. Well, it wasn't the single best. I might give you 3. It's one of the single best things about Rails. There's other single best things about Rails. The early releases of Rails, I'm going to go through these quick, but one thing that's fascinating about this, the official docs only go back to 2.3. I had to dig around a surprising amount in a surprisingly weird set of places for this. Wayback Machine, weird mailing lists, stuff to pull this. I'm skipping all the point releases leading up to Rails, but we got Scriptaculous in the beginning. Oh my gosh, JS UI Sugar for nothing. It took nothing to do this. And then we made Ajax easier. And then we got XML, which you might roll your eyes at. But we did a lot of XML back in those days. That let us integrate with Java applications. We got polymorphic joins in 06. And then Heroku launches. Heroku made DevOps easy, and your price was switching to Postgres. That was like a watershed inflection point in the Rails world. Suddenly, after Heroku became kind of mainstream, you used Postgres. All these idiots who are using MySQL, why aren't they using Postgres? Well, the idiots using MySQL built their app before 2007 or not long thereafter, right? Our GitHubs, our Shopifys, Rosetta Stone, which is one of the companies in my hometown. You just decided if you're willing to pay that tax. But it was a watershed moment because it made deploying easier. Then we get REST. Oh my gosh, did that make like the arguments about how to do controller methods so much easier? We got UTF-8, which meant emoji. Then the Mac suddenly includes Ruby on Rails in the default stack in Leopard. Now everybody starts to buy a Mac to replace those IBM and Dell Latitudes and all those things. We get Action Pack with all those controller things all of those convenience methods that you love. And in 2.2, I'm going to stop just a second to really call out. JRuby was a game changer, because what started this was talking with Java people about how cool Rails was at a dinner at OSCON. And a lot of them were Java people, not because they loved Java, but because they loved open source and building web applications quickly, easily, with tools that were accessible. I could now build something in Rails, pack it up into a WAR file or a jar file. They didn't know if it was Rails or Ruby or anything like that. They just got a WAR file. They put it on their WebSphere application server. Might as well have been struts. But there were people who were delivering applications like that so much cheaper because they built them in Rails instead of struts. But you couldn't tell the difference because it's all running on the JVM. I get excited about that because it was quite an interesting time. Cold Fusion started running on the JVM around then too, so it made everything really easy. And then 2.3, which is the first one you'll see, on the release notes, we get rack, engines, nested object forms, all of this leading up into Rails growing up with version 3. So this is another whole talk in and of itself, the Merbening of Rails, when the Merb folks and the Rails folks got together, and Rails says they won because it's called Rails, but all of the innards that matter are Merb, so Yehuda kind of won, Yehuda Katz kind of won that. And I mean, bundler. We had years of releases without bundler, without unobtrusive JavaScript, without being able to chain active records. I mean, what were we doing? We were living like animals. And then we get the asset pipeline, and we get CoffeeScript. And as much as you might hate that today, it was just like so much easier as a developer to be able to do these things. We got faster dev mode, Ruby 2.0. We're starting to grow up with security and performance. We're then making it easier for developers with Spring and secrets. And we start to say, oh, maybe there's this thing called mobile we should care about when we added action pack variants. So you could do that easier. And then Tenderlove drops active record. You couldn't complain anymore that Rails was inadequate because now it was adequate. It wasn't great. Other things were faster, but it was adequate. And that's a fantastic talk if you dig that one up. We got Active Job Web Console. How have we had these things for so long? That's 2014. And now we get into rocket ship mode. We got Action Cable, Rails API, everything's Rails now. Yarn and Webpack, we take out jQuery, some of us do. System tests, we got encrypted secrets, we've got active storage, we've got all these things, CSP and HTTP2. Developers didn't care about that until they started deploying. We're starting to get more grown up. We're starting to do things that matter on the server. We get Action Mailbox and Action Text, which are crazy fun. We get parallel tests. Then we start getting so many cool contributions finally from some of the big dogs. We get multi-DB improvements. Oh my gosh, you didn't have to use Octopus, or at least Octopus now was official in Rails or some version of it. You got delegated types, which meant cold fusion, which meant computer science people were happy. And then Ruby 7.0. You got Ruby 3 and Zeitwerk and import maps, and we took out Spring because we don't need it anymore. And oh my gosh, Hotwire, again, the world kept getting better for developers. And now we've got Docker files and composite keys and buns. And again, Trilogy. Oh my gosh, I use MySQL in my day-to-day life. I am so excited. We have a Trilogy person here. We can use that. That's the MySQL driver that doesn't require all the MySQL like C-level stuff. It's just great if you're trying to ship stuff. Wow, that was like a talk in and of itself. I'm going to take a deep breath and talk about how else things changed. This one's relevant to everybody here. Community. I'll be honest, the Cold Fusion world had an amazing community. It truly did have an amazing community. There was fun, there was open source, there was quirky, there was excitement, there was crazy. There was also a really cool open source Java community. OSCON had a lot of that, and then there was this traveling conference called No Fluff, Just Stuff, that in the course of a year, all of those presenters went from talking about Java to talking about Rails. Suddenly it became this mobile Rails conference. It was amazing to see that transition of people you know. Glenn was part of that. I think Neil Ford would speak there. There was times when Uncle Bob would speak there. Bob Martin or Robert Martin would speak there. Many of these folks saw those talks by DHH back in the day. They moved over to Ruby, and then Y happened. And if you have not read The Poignant Guide to Ruby, just leave now. You've got permission. Just go out there, get The Poignant Guide to Ruby. And if you've read that, then read Closure. If you haven't read Closure, which is kind of like the follow-up that Steve Klabnik put together, there's just no way to explain why other than say kind of like Tenderlove, but just like even stranger and crazier and more wonderful. So if you know Tenderlove, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know what either of them are talking about, you're really missing out. Be careful Googling Tenderlove. Make sure you put Ruby on there. And you can go take a look at Y's Poignant Guide to Ruby, because that just made things weird. And this is Asheville. Things are weird, right? We had people like Zed Shaw screaming at you he was going to kill you if you didn't learn statistics. We had Giles Bouquet doing crazy things with, I think you say Archaeopteryx, which was his like music composition, algorithmic insanity concert thing he'd do at regional conferences. You had all sorts of people. We've mentioned some of them. Ryan Biggs with Railscast. We had Abdi Grimm, who got mentioned earlier. We had the three Sarahs of Rails, Sarah May, Sarah Gray, and Sarah Allen. We had Katrina Owen talking about therapeutically refactoring. We had Eileen, we had Tenderlove, we had all of these people. And if you don't know who they are, you should start Googling around and finding something about your community. That community generated this, conferences. Unfortunately, Ruby conferences, the website only goes back to 2014. Ruby conferences go back a fair bit more than that. I think it's fun that the screenshot yesterday had this one in Ruby for Good, which is another one I love, scheduled at the same time. Really sorry I'm missing it. Sean's good people. all of these conferences needed people. The way you got people was boot camps, right? So a lot of people, anybody here boot camping? Boot camping? Yeah, I worked with a lot of boot camps. I think there's some great things about boot camps. Boot camps started in 2011, 2012, believe it or not. They started with, well, this kind of boot camp at least. They started with Hungry Academy at Living Social in DC because they had bought up all of the small Rails consultancies and they couldn't buy up anymore, so they needed to build Rails developers. And they had Jeff Casimir, who now runs the Turing School, come out and build something. Difference then, they paid you to go to school. They got a lot of qualified applicants. They paid you the equivalent, I think, of like $35,000 a year while you were in school, which was not a whole year, and then they put you straight into a job at Living Social. It was amazing. So, whew, there went another whole talk. So that's at least 2 of my talks. What did the app look like after all this, after boot camps, after community, after developer experience? Well, I was on a Mac now, and that's true today. It's on Ruby 3.2 with Rails 7.1. It's still enhanced by jQuery. It still uses MySQL 8, but it still uses MySQL. We upgraded to Nginx and Passenger, and it's on what was Slice Host and then Linode, and now it's Akamai, an Ubuntu LTS, Ubuntu 20 LTS small box. What's it look like? You know what I'm gonna say. It looks like this. Kai could care less about what it looks like because it's such a small group that uses it, and they're using it as a tool to solve a problem. So, whew. Where are we going? By the way, that was a Railscast layout, if memory serves. So I didn't even like really do that layout. I think that was from one of the early Railscasts. So community for the win. So where are we going? I mean, I'm sure I'm gonna be developing on something like that, right? And it's gonna be a Linux box. I'm probably gonna use VS Code with like vision goggles, and we're gonna be on Ruby 3, and we're going to be on Rails 8 or 7.2, whatever it gets decided to call it, because I keep hearing both, even at RailsConf. Eventually it'll be on Rails 8. It's still going to be backed by MySQL, I have no doubt. Maybe we're going to try Thruster and Caddy. Maybe you all are trying some of those things as an alternative. And it's probably still going to be on Akamai, because all of these things just work, right? The developer experience gains, the community gains, all of the things give me this wide range of choices, and I can do like Larry Wall and choose to be as lazy as I want to be for this, as long as I solve the problem. So I am pretty sure that tomorrow, it's going to look like that. So anyhow, some takeaways. The single most important thing after 24 years of running this app, and I want you to all remember this as you build new companies in particular, you don't change the database platform. No one ever changes the database platform, sidebar, unless it's Mongo, and then people take Mongo back to real databases. I'm sorry, Mongo people, but that's how it works. So the app started in MySQL. It's still MySQL. The only thing that MySQL ever failed miserably at was modern emoji. Thanks for screwing that up with UTF-8 not being UTF-8. 3 bytes are not 4 bytes MySQL. The other problem is Oracle owns it. But thankfully, we've got MariaDB. And we still have a lot of people on MySQL. Shopify, Basecamp, GitHub, my guy. The database doesn't change. None of them change. Swear to God, in March, I helped his IT person install the 64-bit ODBC driver on his Windows 11 Pro laptop so he could connect his billing app back to it. Swear to God, still the same. How many times have I said, maybe we should do this through Stripe and simplify your thing? Lots of times. But here we are anyhow. So quick takeaways, because I know I'm running out of time. I want you to remember, especially you experienced developers, the pendulum is swinging back and forth, always with this stuff. There's winners and losers, but broad shapes keep reemerging. I mean, in my lifetime, in your all's lifetime, we've gone from local development to cloud development, and it's swinging back local. DHH was like, why do we do CI on the server anymore? Let's just do it on our local laptops, right? The pendulum's swinging. In the beginning, at NCSA, back in the early 90s, mid-90s, all there was open source. You didn't even have any options other than open source. And then it became commercial and closed, the Microsoft, Netscape. I mean, you used to pay for browsers, people. You paid for a browser. I mean, you still pay. It's just a different kind of pay. And now open is how the world works. There used to be a little JS sugar, like with the Scriptaculous, and JS ruled all. All hail JS now with our giant frameworks. And now we're thinking maybe progressive enhancement with a little sugar is the way to go, particularly in the Rails world. Nothing against you, React people. And we went from what the heck's mobile to it must be native mobile to now we're like, well, maybe both have a place. Pendulum swinging. It doesn't swing all the way back all the time, but it's swinging back and forth, right? And one of our goals as developers is to often find the middle there. I want you to know there's evergreen skills you'll learn as one kind of developer that might be useful somewhere else. I mean, my Fortran programming on Cray supercomputers for quantum mechanical matrix decomposition, you wouldn't think that would directly relate to this, but I learned Vim. That's the one thing I learned. Actually, I learned VI because Vim hadn't been improved yet in the late 90s. I was a Visual Basic developer. I've been a DBA. Literally, my job title has been DBA, but now somehow I'm a Rails developer. Well, I'm a director of engineering, but I'm a Rails developer. So some of the things you use are going to be useful longer than you think. MVC has been most of my career. SQL has been most of my career. HTML is still broadly the same. If you squint at it, HTML from eons ago and HTML from now looks the same because my app is HTML from eons ago. There's some of the original jQuery still in there, still runs. There's Bootstrap 3 in there, still runs. If you squint at this stuff, a lot of times it ends up looking the same. And I hate to really, sort of be so self-aggrandizing, but neural nets, all that, all the sexiness, 1989 people. I was doing neural nets in 1989. I have a research paper somewhere from doing that. I mean, it was really hard. It took a long time to do those calculations. We only did 3-layer backpropagation neural networks. I did that in Visual Basic when it didn't have a number, believe it or not. Okay, so stuff isn't new. That's what I want you to take away from this bit. There's evergreen skills. You learn some of them. Some of them you throw away, like all of my CoffeeScript knowledge. I literally threw books away. Really throw away books. I was so happy to throw away those books. Threw away a book on Jenkins. Lots of books I like to throw away from the past. But a lot of these skills are evergreen. And then despite what seems like constant change, you coming to this conference and us telling you all the things that are new that you should be looking at, or especially at a RailsConf or at a RubyConf or OSCON or something like that. The broad strokes are the same, and most of us steer towards the center of that river. A lot of us are T-shaped. We look wide, but we go deep, right? I'm pretty deep in Rails. I was pretty deep in databases at one point. At one point, I knew a whole lot of quantum mechanics, and now I don't know any of it, except out at the edge. But that's how we end up thriving over our careers, by taking a look back and seeing those skills that we have that are useful, even if they didn't seem useful at the time. At Rails World this past fall in Amsterdam, DHH was talking about the Renaissance developer, the one developer who can build an entire application on their own. The return of that developer is sort of a callback to the origins of Rails. One person can do this all. I'd like to think I'm one of those developers. I'm definitely old enough to be a Renaissance web developer, but I think most of you all are that kind of developer too. Each of us are part of this small, quirky community, and we're all one developer able to build and maintain an entire app today and tomorrow and for the next 20 years. So with that said, thanks. Thanks for letting me run through that so quickly. I want to thank the team for putting this together. I'm so excited to have another East Coast RailsConf, or RubyConf, RailsConf, ConfConf. They're all conferences. They're all wonderful. And taking a shot. I haven't done a conference talk in about 10 years. I used to do them all the time. I took some time off, and it's a lot easier when you don't have to do a conference talk. You can go out to lunch with you people, which I didn't do because I was getting ready for this. But thanks. Thanks for 20 years of Ruby commits, for Ruby changes. Can I just ask, who has a commit to Ruby or Rails in here? Okay, I mean, that's a non-trivial number, right? And I bet a lot more of you have commits to gems that people use. And more importantly, you all are solving people's problems, right? And we were talking about that in talks earlier this morning. You were solving, the goal of this is to solve people's problem. Kai's app was not fancy. Kai's app was not exciting. Kai wanted a tool to solve a problem he had. He didn't want to keep putting those CDs in envelopes and shipping them out every week to people. And we solved that. And we've solved that for 24 years. That's pretty amazing. And every year I think he's going to retire, and every year he doesn't. So the app's still going to go on. So anyhow, thanks. That's me. That's a little more about me. It's not hard to find someone named Ashenfelter. I'm not Orly Ashenfelter. He's the economist at Princeton. I'm the other Ashenfelter. So I'll leave it there. If you care about the craziness, I built this with MARP. There's some photos from Unsplash that are mixed in there. I'm going to finally shut up and let you all get on with stuff. Please feel free to grab me over a beer in the hallway. I can tell some great stories about Rails because I know a lot of people in this world and a lot of things that have happened, and I'm happy to talk about them, as you can tell. So thanks a lot.